Hi all. Do we have all the conveners and the chairman for the next session? We can start right away. I think we've exceeded the time from the
Saumil,
previous session.
Saumil, can you hear me? I
Y-
seem to have lost the screen.
Yes,
Uh,
sir. I can hear you. Can you hear me? Can
yes,
everyone hear me?
Okay,
yes.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. Sir,
Can
Dr.
you?
Sangwan, if he has logged in, it would be appropriate if he does the introductions, or sir, you can do it. And we can begin the session right away.
Virender, are you there? Is Virender there?
Yeah,
I
I'm
don't.
I'm there, but please go ahead with the introductions.
Good morning, Virender. How are you? Our first speaker today is Dr. Ramappa Muralidharan from the LVPI. He is a cornea and cataract surgeon for specifically for pediatric ophthalmology. He's going to share the screen very shortly. Uh, there are not too many people who work on congenital corneal disorders, and Dr. Muralidhar Ramappa is one of them. And especially noteworthy is his work on the Peters anomaly, the surgical techniques in Peters anomaly. So, without much ado, let's have Dr. Ramappa. Please go ahead.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for the kind introduction, and I thank all organizers for giving me this opportunity. And today I've been asked to cover on how to unravel congenital cloudy cornea.
We can't hear you, Dr. Muralidhar.
Okay, 1 second.
I will advise others to mute their audio for the time being, if possible.
Are you,
Murli say something.
Dr. Murli, we can't hear you.
okay, I'm sorry.
We can hear you now. What just you said.
Yeah, what about
Please go ahead.
Dr. Murli, you are not audible.
okay? I'm sorry about that.
Now we can hear you. When you said that, we heard that.
What about now, sir?
Yes, yes.
Absolutely.
Can you?
Absolutely.
Still not audible, sir.
Okay.
I don't think he's speaking. I mean, do you have some problem with the slides as such?
Because HAT doesn't
Yes, it's a recorded version.
meaning PCG tend to be in a certain
Swami, can you hear me?
population due to inbreeding. Typically, they are bilateral,
You'll need to cut down on your audio.
subcategorized based on chronological manifestation. It could be neonatal, infantile, late onset. General neonatal may have a very aggressive course and tend to have a recalcitrant response to the conventional surgical. These children manifest with a classic symptomatic triad: epipora, photophobia, blepharospasm, possibly attributed to the epithelial edema. Horizontal corneal diameter is one of the important surrogate marker under 3 years. One of the most common sign is a corneal edema, moving to epithelial edema. The chronicity of the disease causes a permanent stromal edema, which may merit corneal transplantation in 12% of the cases in our cohort. Eye drops can be one of the important manifestation of a primary congenital glaucoma due to rupture in the Descemet's membrane. Although cornea clears after successfully controlling intraocular pressure, but this breaks the Descemet's membrane remains for the lifetime. We call it as a HAP striae. This is clearly evident on an anterior segment ASOCT as well. Can actually contribute to significant astigmatism. Most children present with a bluish corneal opacification. This is one of the hallmark of primary congenital glaucoma. Besides the enlarged view, stretched limbus, high intraocular pressure, ophthalmic manifestation due to stretching of the scleral tissue. We can also consequent in axial myopia, astigmatism, and an isometropia perhaps explain the asymmetrical nature of this disease. Cupping can also be rapidly progressive, seen very early, perhaps due to posterior displacement of lamina cribrosa and enlargement of scleral canal. Optic nerve changes are quite unique. Once the IOP is controlled well, these changes can be reversible, but it may not necessarily result in functional recovery. Actually contribute to the ultimately poor outcome. The key is early recognition and institution of appropriate treatment help restore the vision in these children. The congenital hereditary endothelial dystrophy, which often presents with a bilateral diffuse corneal clouding, varying degree of thickening and opacification, and morphological alteration in Descemet's endothelial complex, stromal lamellae, including the Bowman's membrane. We can present with the mild innocuous disease as in the first picture, and as the disease progresses, can have a dense degenerative pannus, leading to varying degree of anterior stromal destruction and lead to formation of a dense scar. So the key posterior polymorphous dystrophy is a broad spectrum of corneal anterior segment abnormalities. Very rarely, it actually manifests in the first decade, typically seen between second to third decade. The basic mechanism entails metaplastic changes in the corneal endothelium, which acquire some qualities of an epithelium. The posterior corneal lesions are a variable morphology, often appear in a various pattern surrounded by a grayish halo. The back part of the cornea looks vesicular or aorti-like lesions. This is also evident in anterior segment OCT. We can actually see the hyperreflectivity and irregular posterior corneal surface. Examining one of the parents of proband will actually help in clinching the diagnosis. So this can be very subtle in one of the world. And OCT helps in picking up these lesions. They may have abnormal depositions in the Descemet's endothelial complex. The retroillumination actually shows a classic puree-orange configuration wherein you have a numerous vesicle cholesterol band. And these cases can have a glossy membrane and varying degree of peripheral anterior synechia formation. That is one of the important negative prognostic indicator for a corneal transplantation. It almost mimics the iridocorneal endothelial syndrome. However, later may have a corneal edema, glaucoma, correctopia, fast formation, but it tends to be sporadic and unilateral. The X-linked endothelial dystrophy is an extremely rare and retroillumination. The proband is showing a moon crater-like landscape, and mother has again a beaten metal appearance that helps in clinching the diagnosis. And these cases are vulnerable to develop a severe form of a band-shaped keratopathy very early in the natural course. Mucopolysaccharidosis is a life-limiting disease. Depending on the type of enzyme involved, you can have a various spectrum of corneal involvement. One of the most common is a type 1 and a type 4 in Indian continent. Dense grayish white with a granularity. The metabolic disease can clog the cornea via accumulation of pathway product. If the product is produced well within the cornea, the clouding may be found throughout the cornea. If the level of product is elevated in the blood, then the peripheral cornea, may be involved. Anti-segmental CT also shows marked thickening of the corneal stroma. The classic systemic feature can help in clinching the diagnosis of a lysosomal disorder, unlike other causes of the cloudy cornea. The type 4 will have 100% cornea, and these cases can achieve extremely good outcome following a lamellar transplantation. And Alcian blue classically shows abnormal glycogen deposition within the lamellae. Access. Often these cases may have underlying glaucoma, optic nerve abnormalities, including the retina involvement due to progressive. Therefore, it is very important to diagnose these cases much early in the natural course. And most of these interventions are possible even before the onset of musculoskeletal changes. Ophthalmologists can play a crucial role in diagnosing MPS very early in the course. Coming to congenital hereditary stromal dystrophy, it is extremely rare autosomal dominant condition, so wherein they have a non-progressive diffuse bilateral corneal clouding with a flake-like whitish opacities. They can appear immediately after birth, although the spots can increase with the age, are associated with the strabismus or nystagmus. This is a slit we've actually shown the granular flaky-like deposits. Unlike other conditions, your cornea normal in size, normal thickness, endothelial function is normal, and no systemic involvement. That's how we can actually differentiate with other conditions. And also corneal epithelium is much smoother here without any epithelial edema. Typically need a corneal transplantation during the adolescence, and they do extremely well following a lamellar corneal transplant. The histology of lining. The children with a cloudy cornea need a meticulous ophthalmic assessment, and diagnosis often suggested by the constellation of clinical signs. In certain cases, we may have to use either histopathological or a genetic evidence to arrive at the diagnosis. Therefore, ophthalmologists can play a crucial role in diagnosing metabolic disorder very early on, thereby actually maximizing their life expectancy and adding quality to their life. Thank you for your patience hearing.
Yeah, thank you once again, BOA, for this opportunity. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you, Dr. Muralidhar. Dr. Radhika Tandon is the Eye Bank Woman of India. If there is, since the last 28 years, she's been with the AIMS, National Eye Bank and Stem Cell Research, and also the National Organ Transplant Committee, which makes all the rules. So if you have any panga with any of those guidelines, you know whom to blame, right, Radhika? All yours, Radhika. Please go ahead. Pediatric keratoplasty. Radhika, you're muted. You'll need to unmute yourself.
We can see your presentation, but we can't hear you.
Yes. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Very kind introduction, and I'm very grateful to Bombay Ophthalmological Association to have invited me for today's session. So I'm going to talk about keratoplasty in children.
You need to be louder.
Okay. Is it better now? Is the audio better?
थोड़ा और दिल्ली आप दिल्ली से हो थोड़ा और वॉल्यूम बढ़ा दीजिए.
My volume is actually maximum. Is it better now?
Yeah, it's better, definitely.
We'll manage. Yeah.
All right. So talking about keratoplasty in children, prior to 1970s, pediatric keratoplasty was uncommonly performed. Most corneal surgeons considered it a high-risk keratoplasty, predominantly because of an increased risk of rejection, higher failure rates, and poorer visual outcomes. If you look at the indications of keratoplasty in our country, 60% of cases in children were healed infectious keratitis with corneal scar. So as such, keratoplasty in children is difficult with poor outcomes. And over and above that, we have a more challenging situation to deal with because we are further dealing with poor prognosis cases. Secondly, I'd like to highlight is the timing of surgery. There are certain gray areas about when is the right time, and I like to explain by giving some evidence from literature that there was no exact consensus. For example, there was a study presented by Lowe et al. That children less than 5 years exhibited poorer graft survival as compared to those who were grafted at the age of 5 to 12 years. On the other hand, another paper by Karadag et al. Showed that early surgery was associated with a higher risk of graft failure. The only thing this indicates is that one cannot have a one-size-fits-all policy. Of course, one would like to graft the child as soon as possible because of the risk of amblyopia. But it's important to have the parents understand the importance of the prognosis and the long-term outcome. But largely, we would like to encourage that the patient should be transplanted as early as possible. Now, what are the challenges of operating in children? The eyeball is small in dimension. There is decreased scleral rigidity. We can overcome this to some extent by the use of Fleringer rings. Of course, the surgery is done under general anesthesia, but this will also imply repeated general anesthesia exposure later on for EOAs. There's an increased risk of rejection, glaucoma, and infection. And a well-done surgery is of no use if you're not able to restore clear sight by the proper prescription of glasses, which includes amblyopia therapy and counseling of the parents regarding the need for proper follow-up and post-op care. So looking at some outcomes here, this is a study from Wills Eye Hospital, which is a very well-established center, excellent surgeons and all the facilities. And even there, looking at the data from 2015, it showed that the mean age at the time of keratoplasty was 24 months plus minus 39 months. So almost 2 to 3 years of age was their mean. And the mean follow-up duration was very reasonable, 3 years. And the overall mean graft survival time was about 45 months. And the survival rate was about 75%. But the thing to look at here is a comparison of the survival in kids who had glaucoma versus those who didn't. So if you have a child who has a corneal opacity as well as glaucoma, that would be the kind of patient who is likely to do poorly and would require more careful attention in the postoperative period. And patients who were able to achieve ambulatory vision at the last follow-up was about 50%. I'm not sure if on your screens also the slides are getting covered by the panel, and I apologize. Maybe I should have rearranged them for online presentation. And I apologize if some of the data is getting obstructed by the panel.
No, they're not.
Okay. Lamellar procedures in children is another important development over the past several years. And this is something that we encourage because when you do customized component replacement therapy, it's much better in terms of the outcomes. So if you have an anterior problem, you'll do a DALC. And if there is an endothelial involvement, one will do a DSEC. So certainly there are benefits of having lamellar procedures. So just to go over where we've come. So I had explained from the 1970s to now we're in 2021. We hesitate less to operate children. We do not mind operating as early as 2 or 3 months of age when it is needed. And we can get good results. But as you can see, this child has been grafted in both eyes, but there's a slight divergent squint in the right eye. So this is the time to notice and then obviously make sure that the patching is being done properly, and you have to combine with the squint specialists. So what are the scenarios now? With this knowledge, we need to do more screening for patients to make sure that children who can be benefited by early intervention do not lose out. We need to build resources more, I would say, for support of follow-up, because I will not encourage all corneal surgeons to do pediatric keratoplasty, but certainly we can take more help from pediatric non-corneal surgeons to help us with the follow-up. And of course, periodic interim analysis, so one keeps keeps identifying which are the loose areas, which are the weak areas, which are the things that one can improve to improve the outcomes. So case selection, look at comorbidities, counsel the parents, and teamwork to give a good result. Now, basically, I would say that you may have to have certain variations in technique, like for example, okay, 1 second. This video will require permission. Yeah, so if you see a patient like this, the corneal diameter is reasonable, but there is a extension of the limbus into the corneal area. So if one had to excise this opacity, one would actually be removing the limbal stem cells as well. So a case like this, one could, disinsert the limbal area, retract it, or go for a smaller graft. It's important to recognize this during the surgery. With the use of ASOCT, one can also get an idea as to what is the actual pathology and what is the anterior chamber looking like. UBM is also a very useful tool so that you know what to expect in anticipation and you are better prepared during the surgery. So here I'm showing how I am gently disinserting that the limbal tissue to try to preserve the limbal stem cell niche, and then one would proceed to trephine. And as you would see, I marked out the size of the trephine that I would be using. I usually would say 7 millimeter is the smallest, but sometimes you may have to go to 6.5 millimeters, but not smaller than that because you're too close to the visual axis, plus you're transplanting too few endothelial cells. So this is just a little modification. I will not show the entire video because of lack of time. The other thing I would like to say, it's very important to engage the eye banking community and get them charged up with the idea that they must convey to the community that if they donate corneas, that one is able to help children. To give an example, when we held the eye bank meeting in Patna, this was a few years ago, but after that, eye banking in Bihar has got a big boost. So it is very creditable that with the entire ecosystem of the corneal surgeons and the eye bankers going to different parts of the country which are underserved, one can help the technicians and the counselors, because these people can never afford to go for conferences, and they are the ones who need to be motivated to work with the community and to provide good corneas. Comorbidities, one should reach out to colleagues, particularly for glaucoma. And the other thing is you can individually innovate your techniques of operating such patients. Personally, I would like to share that I've started using a bandage contact lens on the table of all the pediatric cases. A week later, so that you don't have any problems of epitheliopathy or any epithelialization or even the irritation from the sutures. A week after surgery, we do the EOA. At that time, the BCL is removed and the intraocular pressure is checked and so on. And then the next EOA is done after a month. The other modification is for the first 1 month when you want to have a higher dose of immunosuppression to prevent the rejection. Plus, it's not very easy to put multiple drops in the eyes of the children. So we've started using a combination of moxifloxacin and dexamethasone 4 times a day for the first month. And after that, we switch over to a solution, prednisolone phosphate, rather than acetate. But it's very important to tell the parents not to keep putting this dexamethasone combination for months together. It has to be put only for the first month and then switch over to prednisolone and early suture removal. So
if you could just conclude faster.
I've done that. So basically, this is to give you several examples of cases which can be operated. Here are some examples of cases which have been operated very early on in age, the Peters anomaly. Here's another patient where with close follow-up, we were able to save the eye from a graft rejection. This is an example of Ched where she had a PK in one eye and later had a DSEC in the other. And here again is an example of sclerocornea. And please note that all of these cases we're using very young donors, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, or 5-year-old donors. This is a one-eyed child, which has shown good results. And similarly, keratoconus, one can do DALC and very careful follow-up. This patient is Peters plus syndrome, and 8 to 10 years after surgery, he is maintaining good vision and going to school and leading a normal life. So with that, I'd like to finish here. I'd like to acknowledge all the work being done by all the colleagues at work to look after these patients and make sure that they are able to lead a normal life with good sight. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. I'm sure on Nikhil and the others would have some questions which we'll take later. Right now, I'm going to call the West Zone at least the Gujarat keratoplasty expert, that's Paras Mehta. Last 26 years, she's been doing eye banking work and set up her own eye bank, the model eye bank. What's important is that this is not just an eye bank, but it's also a training center. And that is the key. Taking things further from Bhartiben Lavangia, we give you Paras Mehta. Paras, all yours.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for a kind introduction. At the outset, I would like to, is it possible to, are you able to see my screen?
We're looking at you. Tari, you have to go to share screen.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Yeah, let me see.
Sir, good morning, everybody. I request all the speakers, please stick to the time. Otherwise, we can lose last topics. So please stick to the time.
I'm unable to do that. Are you able to see that now?
No.
Paras, it's not coming in. It's not coming in. Shall we?
Can we go to Dr. Nikhil Gokhale and then come back to you again?
Yeah, I'll do that. No problem.
Yeah, Nikhil. Well, Nikhil needs no introduction in Mumbai. There is not too many guys who can come in as Mr. Nice Guy. That's Nikhil for you, Mr. Nice Guy. Please go ahead, Nikhil.
So I thought today I'll share with you some images of mebography. I have no financial interest in the equipment. Basically, whenever we look at a patient of either an aqueous deficiency or a evaporative dry eye, we all look to do the history. We do the Shermers, the breakup times. We look at surface staining and we look at the lid margins and the meibomian glands. But what we sometimes can do and should be doing is a mebography, which can give us a lot of additional information and can help us decide what's best for the patient. We can use infrared light-based equipment, and I typically use a keratograph 5M. You can also use an OCT-based device, a confocal, or even an autorefractor can give you an image. We all know that basically MGD is where there is an obstruction of the glands, there is a change in the secretions, and because of which you get inflammation, symptoms, and surface disease. And as much as 50% of our patients in one study in India have this. It's a very important cause of evaporative dry eye. It's much more common in women and in the elderly. And what's important is that the mebography is very reproducible, very accurately can help you to evaluate the disease status and plan your treatment. If we look at a composite of presence of symptoms, lid margin scores, and mebography, we have about 100% sensitivity in picking up MGD. However, if we even take two of them together, we are fairly accurate. So at least if two of these are positive, we can decisively conclude a diagnosis of MGD. So the normal gland images are basically because of the presence of a lipid in the meibomian glands which reflect infrared light. So you can see the gland ductules and the acinar structure in the lower lid and the upper lid. Basically, the abnormalities that are normally seen in patients with MGD may be, one, you need to look at the number of glands, whether there is a loss of glands, which indicates that there is a permanent damage. You need to see where is the location of these glands which are lost. You also need to look if the glands are having a shorter length, which indicates they may be less functional. We also need to look whether the glands are dilated or they are tortuous or they are very thin, and which might indicate the production of mebum and the flow rate. And we also sometimes see glands which may not have any lipid, or they may be non-functioning glands. There are different scoring systems. You can do MEBO score, which is based on a third loss of the gland architecture. You can use a MEBO scale, which is based on a quarter loss progressively of the glands. And you can also use automated system, though they are not routinely available to us, to grade the amount of dropout of the meibomian glands. So I just put some pictures from my clinic where this subjectively looks like a grade 1 MEBO score, where about less than a third of the gland architecture is showing a dropout. These are some patients where you can see about maybe a MEBO score of 2, maybe 50 to 65% of glands are lost. And this is MEBO score 3, where more than 65% loss of gland architecture is seen on the mebography images. And then you will have some patients where there are absolutely no glands seen in the mebography, and these may indicate that there is a total obstruction which has led to a total atrophy of these meibomian glands. Interestingly, we also sometimes see very tortuous and irregular glands, and what this indicates is that there are possibly a loss of some glands which creates more space, and there is possibly a loss of the stromal architecture which allows the glands to spring apart or coil and become more tortuous. We know these are less functional and might indicate that the patients may have problems. Sometimes when you don't see the glands, these could be actually there, but you're not seeing them because the conjunctiva overlying the meibomian glands or the tarsal plate may be thick, inflamed, or it might have some sort of follicles which is obscuring the glands. So these we call them as ghost glands. And sometimes when you treat these patients, you'll suddenly start seeing a better architecture of the meibomian gland. So before we diagnose a gland atrophy or a gland dropout, which is irreversible, we need to be aware that it could be false positive. Sometimes we see glands which are very thin, as you can see here. So basically you're just seeing the ductules. There is no acinar structure seen here, which possibly indicates maybe that the acini are significantly damaged and there is a lot of hypoproduction of meibum in these patients. And in some patients you can see dilated large glands with a very prominent acinar structure, possibly which might indicate that there is obstructive stasis and accumulation of meibum in these glands. So basically, just to say that when you do a mebography, the additional information that you get apart from your clinical evaluation is that you can come to know, based on whether you are seeing obstruction with intact glands, obstruction with a partial dropout or atrophy, or an obstruction with a total atrophy, is you know what is the structural amount of damage which is already present before you start your treatment, whether this damage is reversible or it has reached an irreversible stage, and it helps you to decide what treatment can be given to this patient and what is the expected outcome of that treatment that you can get in a given patient. So basically it's very useful for patient education. In my clinic, I would see a lot of patients coming in with epiphora and evaporative dry eye who don't understand why they don't get better after going to so many clinics. And when you can show them an image, at least you can explain them the pathology that's going on, and they're more responsive to treatment options, and you can always explain them the amount of damage which is there, whether the damage is reversible or it is irreversible, and it helps you to decide what is the best modality that you can take for these patients. We know there are some light based or massage based treatments which may not be possible if there is a total atrophy of the glands, and this is something that you can pick up only when you do a mebography. However, I must say that there is always a difference in the correlation between symptoms, the gland function, and the lipid layer. And that's why possibly adding a mebography to the other armamentarium that we have in these patients of evaporative dry eye can help us manage our patients better. Thank you all for listening, and request Paras to go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Nikhil Gokhale. Can I just speak for a second, if Dr. Saumil will allow me? I would just like to thank Dr. Nikhil Gokhale, because as usual, he has put up a beautiful cornea and a refractive program. In spite of COVID times, he put up a beautiful galaxy of stars, including himself. And that is a scientific feast for everybody. And, one of the nicest and the most humble person in BOA and MOS. Thank you, Dr. Nikhil Gokhale, sir, for being what you are always.
Thank you.
Hey, Mr. Nice Guy. Thank you, Nikhil. Ragini, that was so much necessary. Thank you. And
thank you, sir. Thank you. I'm your kid and I have trained under you.
And Paras, if you are ready, or we have our Mumbai's homegrown Soma also ready.
I'm ready. I'll just try to share my screen. If you can see that, you just let me know.
Go ahead, please. Go ahead. There is a lady called Manjula on our group. She can help in case you have issues.
Yeah, I just called her up, but I'm just waiting for her maybe answer. Like, Oh, no. No.
Ah, there you are.
Am I
Hey,
there?
that's me. How come
No,
you're
no, no.
showing me?
That's very strange, actually. I'm not able to. Yeah.
Okay, Paras, we'll get on back to you later.
You
What we'll do is
select your desktop. Don't select the view of the this one.
Yeah.
Zoom. There is one written one. You select that one and then share. In your computer, there is a desktop scene. Four, 5 things are seen. In that, our photos are seen. Don't select that. Select the other one and then share.
Madam, have you got your presentation open, madam?
It is already open. Yeah.
Okay. In that case, you just when you do a share screen, you'll be seeing a thumbnail of your presentation.
This is happening for the first time. This has never happened earlier at in any of the meetings.
But the other option is just close your presentation and open it back again. Close PowerPoint and open it again.
Sai, thank you for the input, Sai. And we also need to acknowledge the work by Numero Technologies, Sai and his entire team. They've been doing initially conferences, elections, everything. He's like the Prashant Kishore in ophthalmology.
Thank you, doctor.
Yes, sir. Thank you, thank you, Sai Dada.
Welcome, madam.
Paras, are you on or shall?
Yeah. I think I'll take a time. I'll speak to somebody and maybe you can go ahead with the next.
Soma, can you come in? I'll give you a brief introduction of Mumbai's own girl. Soma is, her achievements at LVP and elsewhere are legendary. But two of the greatest compliments paid by her teachers was that she's one of the most humble girls that has ever graced Sion Hospital. One, and second is she has a passion for teaching and clinical trials. Soma, I can't say anything more. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, sir. And yes, I'm Mumbai's own, girl, if you want to use girl now. Can you hear me and can you see the slide that is put up?
Yes,
both.
All right, good, excellent. So in the next 8, I'll try to bring it down to 7 minutes or so. I'm just going to talk a little bit about one of my other passions apart from teaching, that is scleritis. And Nikhil gave me this very interesting title, thanks Nikhil, from white to red to white. So we all know here that scleritis is of course inflammation of the sclera. It has a very characteristic clinical picture. And the problem with this disease is that it's extremely painful, one of the most painful, one of the causes of the most ocular pain that you can have in ophthalmological diseases. And it's very indolent, and you know that it's locally destructive. Luckily, it's a very rare disease. So in the general population, it's pretty rare. But the problem here is that when the patients come in with this disease, you never know, but 1/3 to half of them may have a serious systemic disease. And even if they don't, it disrupts the cornea, the uveal tissue, and it can cause a blinding kind of a disorder for the eye. So that's the importance of knowing about scleritis. When we want to classify scleritis or treat patients in the clinic, so it's very useful to go through the original classification by Watson and Harry, which is still very relevant. So in the Indian subcontext, it's good to also think about infectious. So whenever a patient comes to me, I do think broadly about infectious versus a non-infectious scleritis, and certain conditions which can look like scleritis, so they can be masquerades. But most of the time, we do see non-infectious scleritis, and that can simply be classified as anterior versus a posterior scleritis. When it is anterior, look at the kind of necrosis that there is. Is it necrotizing scleritis, which is a more severe variety, or is it the non-necrotizing scleritis? You know that the non-necrotizing scleritis can be divided as diffuse and nodular. You see some examples here of diffuse scleritis. This is the case of nodular scleritis. This is a case of necrotizing scleritis. In necrotizing, you have two entities, one in which there is a lot of massive, obvious inflammation and destruction like this particular picture here. And the second kind, it's sort of written as without inflammation, but of course there's inflammation, but here it is a more silent kind of a prolonged, slow inflammation here that you might see in rheumatoid arthritis. And also we have one more variant of scleritis, which is surgically induced, which can be either necrotizing or it can be diffuse. So that was in broad about the classification of scleritis. Moving on, so when the patient comes to us in the clinic and we're thinking that, could it be scleritis based on the symptoms or signs that the patient has? So the top 3-4 questions that I ask myself is that, am I looking at a patient of episcleritis, which is much sort of a nicer cousin to have, or is it scleritis, which is the evil cousin, or is it a masquerade? The second question I would look at is that if it is, yes, it is scleritis, so is it the necrotizing or the non-necrotizing kind of scleritis? Third question would be that if it is looking like necrotizing, but hey, look, is this an infection? So does the patient have history of trauma, or the patient has history of recent surgery? So I would definitely keep infection at the back of my mind. And then when I think about the answers to these questions, I'll also formulate a plan for investigations as well as formulate a plan for management. So just a brief reminder that episcleral inflammation, we have inflammation in the anterior part, in the episcleral tissue. Although it can look very dramatic, the patient can come with a very red looking nodule, but actually it's an innocuous condition. The classic feature would be that you apply phenylephrine when you dilate the pupil, and you can see most of this redness will blanch away. The patient won't really have a severe boring pain, but will actually say that he has a mild pain or a tenderness. So when sometimes you have a doubt whether this is scleritis or episcleritis, I find that using phenylephrine literally blanches out most of the prominent blood vessels, like you can see in this patient, except for a few prominent vessels here, and very confident in saying that it is episcleritis. On the other hand, when it is scleritis, so you have inflammation both in the episcleral tissue as well as deeper in the scleral tissue. And this is the entity that we need to watch out for. So what we have of late started to do is use the OCT, that is in a cornea diagnostics anyway, to image the scleral tissue. And this helps us very nicely delineate whether the inflammation is only located. So this is a case of scleritis. So if it was episcleritis, it would be only located, the conjunctiva would show fluid and thickening like this, and the episcleral tissue would show this edema. But as you go deep down, this tissue would appear normal. But in this particular instance, you can see how the scleral fibers seem to be pushed up or edematous. So this is a case of scleritis based on OCT. Of course, you don't need an OCT, but it's really useful in these cases. So episcleritis, it's innocuous. I usually explain to the patient that yes, it's irritating and bothersome to you that you keep getting a red eye, but you won't get visual loss with the disease itself. So let us not worry too much about it. I barely investigate in episcleritis cases. On the other hand, if it's scleritis, examination is very important. If you just look at the patient putting on the slit lamp, you might miss a lot of other findings. The same patient, when you look centrally, has barely any inflammation, but when you make the patient look in all directions of gaze, as in these pictures here, you can see that the patient has a sort of a diffuse anterior scleritis involving all the areas, as you can see in the slit lamp images. So this is the problem with scleritis, that the pathology can be more than what you can see in the patient. Whereas in the case of necrotizing scleritis, like these images here, it's very obvious that the patient has scleritis, so you won't miss these entities, and the patient's symptomatology also will be very high. They'll have a lot of pain, and they may even have some systemic history as well. Nodular scleritis can sometimes be confusing. So you might see clear looking areas in the same patient where there's a new nodule, but when you apply the red-green filter, those so-called clear looking areas are actually areas where the capillaries have dropped out. And this was a case with past episode of scleritis, and the patient now has a new episode or a recurrence. So most of us in our clinic will end up seeing more of the diffuse anterior scleritis, which is more frequent, followed by the nodular scleritis, which is a little bit less frequent, but more sort of recalcitrant to therapy. So you keep often you see these cases more. And don't forget to examine the patient, take proper history. Sometimes the patient can walk in with either these joint deformities, as in this elderly male patient, or can have effusion of the joint or history of effusion of the joint, as in this younger female patient. Both have rheumatoid arthritis as a systemic etiology, and both have more of a scleromalacia kind of picture for the eye. Posterior scleritis is usually, it's less often associated with known systemic entities, but it can be confusing, and the retina specialist will tell you that the patients can present what looks like with a choroiditis, but when you do an FFA, it may not even unmask the case of scleritis, but the hallmark feature would be the B scan, where yes, you would see choroidal thickening, but more importantly, you would see fluid in the subtenon space, and this is the T sign. which is hallmark of posterior scleritis. So just a few slides on how to proceed. You have a patient coming in with scleritis, you've diagnosed it. So how to proceed? What should you do? So for me, the points I look at is what's the anatomical diagnosis, the age and gender of the patient, how severe is the disease, and what is the systemic component I have for the patient. So if it is a case of diffuse anterior scleritis, we know that these conditions will improve rapidly. So I may not be very, very aggressive. I may not directly go to immunomodulators in these patients. If it's nodular, I know that they're a little bit more resistant to therapy and prone to recurrences. So I may go to immunomodulators in the first instance itself. If it's necrotizing, I would really throw in everything, investigate the patient, look for systemic component, and my treatment regimen would be very aggressive for these patients. And posterior scleritis, as I mentioned, that slightly lesser chance of systemic component, but still I would investigate these patients. And some of the patients you can get away without having to use long-term therapy, but maybe a 2-3 months therapy might be adequate. Age and gender, you know that rheumatoid arthritis, a female predisposition, whereas ANCA is a male predisposition, but then either disease can happen in both the sexes. A young or a middle-aged patient versus elderly, a young middle-aged patient, I would be more aggressive with immunomodulators, whereas in the elderly, I would avoid prolonged steroids or cyclophosphamide, for example. In pediatric patients, definitely I would avoid steroids, and my investigation would also include certain unusual entities such as HLA-B50, B51 as an etiology for the scleritis. So when do you investigate? Often I'm asked this question. In the case of episcleritis, as I said, I barely investigate. Maybe it's persistent or recurrent, then I might investigate. The reason being that whenever I investigate, I've really got nothing. But if the patient presents with scleritis, I try my best to investigate all patients of scleritis.
If you could sum up, Soma.
Yeah.
Could sum up.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, all scleritis need to be investigated, and we can do certain panel of investigations for these patients, which I won't go through. In summary, what is the treatment for these patients? Maybe the first line could be NSAIDs, but most of the time I resort to using systemic steroids and methotrexate for many of my patients. And a few of these patients with very recalcitrant disease, I do use cyclophosphamide, and nowadays we have availability of biologicals which help us treat these patients. So that's all I had for today. Thank you very much for having me on this stellar program.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Paras, last chance.
I'll try that.
Yeah, go ahead, Paras. After you is Bhaskar, who's been chewing his nails and waiting.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
See and hear.
Thank you so much.
Great.
I just go into the presenters view. Yeah, I mean, thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks to BOA and especially to Dr. Nikhil for having me here. My topic is what lies underneath. Especially, I would be talking on ocular surface neoplasias. I would like to begin this talk with an interesting case. 58-year-old female presented to us with redness, heaviness, foreign body sensation, and inability to open her left eye for past 4 months. She was treated off and on with soft steroids and lubricants, and this was her clinical presentation when she came to us. These were the differentials which were kept in mind by previous treating doctors, and probably, you know, if you examine these patients with rose Bengal dye and red-free filter on slit lamp, you will be able to see the lesion much better. You can see a lot of, opaque, white, like small dot-like lesions suggestive of leukoplakic lesions or keratin sitting onto the limbus and the conjunctival surface. And this is a placoid kind of a lesion with very thick tortuous feeder vessels. This lesion was extending from 11 o'clock. If you look little carefully, 11 o'clock to 5 o'clock with corneal and perilimbal conjunctival involvement. As you can see here, there is a lot of corneal involvement here. So these cases have to be looked into with great caution and detail. This is how it appears with rose Bengal staining and on red-free filter. She received 5 cycles of topical MMC, and later she needed surgical. So after 5 cycles, it almost reduced to this level. And then she was subjected for surgical excision with cryo to free conjunctival margin. And the surface was reconstructed with amniotic membrane. So oftentimes this diagnosis is at times missed or it is misdiagnosed. According to a series by Dr. Santosh Honavar, almost 45% of the times this is this happens that it is initially misdiagnosed. The ocular surface squamous neoplasia comprises a wide spectrum of dysplastic changes of the ocular surface epithelium, starting from CIN to invasive carcinomas. This is a very nice schematic diagram explaining the same thing. The first panel shows normal epithelial cells. The second, where there is a conjunctival intrinsic neoplasia, where the deeper layers of the epithelial cells are replaced by dysplastic cells and atypical cells. While this is the panel which shows carcinoma in situ, where all the cells are dysplastic, but the the basement membrane is still intact, the pink area. While in this picture, the basement membrane is also involved, and there is a breach in that, and the cells have invaded below that. So that is an invasive squamous cell carcinoma. Let's look at certain known facts. The most common ocular surface neoplasm. This is one of the most common ocular surface neoplasm. The prevalence is increased in the equatorial regions of the world, UV light being the most known risk factor. Even mutation in tumor suppressor gene, that is P53, has been reported secondary to UV light exposure. Hereditary impairment of DNA repair, that occurs in xeroderma pigmentosa, also increases the risk of ocular surface squamous neoplasia. In association with HIV and HPV infections has been well known. And HIV-associated neoplasias may demonstrate rapid growth and aggressive behavior and should be suspected, especially in patients younger than 50 years of age. Morphologically, they can present as gelatinous, leukoplakic, papilliform, nodular, or sometimes nodular ulcerative lesion. The clinical variety could be diffuse, corneal, conjunctivocorneal, invasive with scleral extension or orbital extension. The key diagnostic features would be, it would usually be present in interpalpebral region, epicenter being at the limbus. There would be presence of feeder vessels. There could be presence of keratin, pigmentation. At times, there would be intrinsic vascularity, corneal component, and intraocular orbital extension. Clinical features overlap with those of other ocular surface lesions, making the diagnosis of ocular surface squamous neoplasia made solely on clinical assessment little difficult. We can take help of ASOCT, anterior segment OCT, UBM, and impression cytometry as non-invasive diagnostic modalities. CT scan is helpful in knowing the extension of orbital extension, especially when there is an extensive lesion. And at times, people have used confocal microscopy as well. This is another example where you can see that this almost can be passed as pterygium, because this patient was diagnosed as pterygium and was advised cataract and pterygium surgery. If you look little closely, this lesion is temporal with a patch of keratin onto the surface, with a grayish-looking hipped-up epithelium, with a fimbriated edge, better seen on the retroillumination with yellow arrows, as you can see here, and with a dilated pupil. This is another example of a similar lesion. This was a recurrent lesion. Like initially, this patient had undergone a pterygium surgery and a cataract surgery together. And this patient presented with recurrent red eye, and you can see that there is a very distinct fimbriated edge of a grayish, whitish looking lesion onto the corneal surface. If not looked carefully, one can easily miss these findings. These are different examples of different presentations. You can see that the lesion is localized and small. But if you look little more carefully, you will be able to see the extent little more with rose Bengal dye and red-free filter. These are different examples of similar neoplasias in different clinical stages. As you can see here, corneal lesions with more feeder vessels, much more better seen on red-free filter. This is a very extensive lesion with nodular appearance, with keratin sitting onto the lesion, and sometimes you can see an ulcerated area also because of the Dellen effect onto the cornea. So the diagnostic tools could be mainly clinical. One can use impression cytology, but that would give an information about only the superficial cells. Can go for incisional biopsy, can go for excisional biopsy, which is the best tool. Can go for ASOCT or HROCT. UBM can, whenever there is deeper lesion and lot of keratin sitting onto the cornea, then probably we'll not be able to delineate the extent based on the OCT, and then UBM can help. CT scan if there is involvement of the orbit, and confocal microscopy also can be tried. In anterior segment OCT, one can see that there is increased epithelial thickness if it is more than 120 micron, which is more specific for ocular surface squamous neoplasia. The depth of involvement can also be seen if there is no shadowing, and there would be always a sharp transition between involved and uninvolved areas. Here you can see that in this picture, there is involvement of the stroma as well, and the epithelium as well as the stroma. So you can decide the line of management based on your anterior segment OCT findings. Sometimes when there is a lot of shadowing, you cannot judge the reference. These are the situations where probably UBM can help. So OSSN has a classic appearance on OCT with 3 characteristic features. It would be hyperreflective, thickened epithelium with an abrupt transition point between normal and abnormal epithelium. The management can be both topical chemotherapy and surgical. Surgical is a gold standard, but in recent times, like in last 2 decades, there are a lot of advances in the development of topical chemotherapy. It can be essentially useful for corneal surface neoplasia if there is a diffuse placoid lesion. If the patient is compliant for follow-ups, it can be used as well as an adjuvant therapy for age involvement for dysplastic or CIN lesions, and chemo reduction prior to the surgical management. While surgical management is useful for invasive squamous neoplasia, when we are not sure of the invasion or depth, if it is a localized nodular tumor, if there is intolerance to the topical chemotherapy, or there is a poor compliance. These are the chemotherapeutic drugs which can be used for chemo reduction or for treatment of the neoplasia. The doses are like MMC can be used as 0.02 to 0.04%, 1 week on or 1 week off cycle, or sometimes 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off cycle, depending on surgeon's choice. Interferon alpha 2B also can be used, which has to be used in the dose of 1 lakh international units 4 times a day. The cycle is 6 weeks. And 5-fluorouracil, 1 person 4 times a day for 1 week on and 3 weeks off. The surface toxicity is more with MMC and 5-fluorouracil, but it is the interferon alpha 2B is less toxic and it is gentle onto the surface. These are the other factors, like sometimes MMC is easily available, while interferon 2B sometimes it may not be available, or it's little expensive if the patient is not affording.
Aras, you'll need to
I'll just
wind up, please, because we are really running short of time.
I'll just quickly summarize. So this is another example which is treated with just topical management. You can see the lesion has disappeared completely.
Run through.
Yeah, I'll just run through. Can I just, this is a just 60-second video. Can I just run through that? Essentially, the surgery is done with a non-touch technique. You can just mark the area, and 4 millimeter marking is done to include the extension of the lesion. And on the corneal side, one can do alcohol epithelectomy with the help of alcohol swab, and you can just almost reflect the epithelium with the help of knife, and you can remove the full lesion intact without causing any seedling of the lesion into the other areas. And the surface is reconstructed with the help of amniotic membrane.
Thank you.
These are the histopathological pictures. And to summarize, clinical pulse would be suspect neoplasm with rapidly growing conjunctival mass, not responding to therapies. If there are 2 or more feeder vessels, presence of leukoplakia, variation in color, or predilection towards the bleeding, all constitutes red flags for malignancy. The recurrence rate as high as 50% is reported in incompletely excised tumors. So surgically, you have to be very careful excising it. Patients with an atypical pterygium should be observed very closely to the possibility of conjunctival tumor. And chemotherapeutic agents as an adjunct to complete surgical excision improves long-term prognosis. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Paras. Thank you. And my apologies for the glitches that you had before. I'm going to call Bhaskar now. He's going to, he's basically from Nair, from Mumbai, then gone to AFMC, and then he's been at Shankar Netralaya since. OSD and keratoprosthesis are his basic areas of interest, but hats off to Nikhil that chemical burns ke liye you've called in a Bhaskar. Bhaskara Namaha.
Is my slides visible?
Yes.
Yeah. So I would like to thank BOA and Dr. Nikhil for inviting me. So I'll briefly touch up upon the management of chemical injury in the acute phase, because chronic phase is going to be touched by Dr. Sangwan and subsequently by Dr. Nidhi in another session. So no financial interests. So basically, when you're looking at chemical injury, you're talking about an ophthalmic emergency, which is potentially devastating, can cause significant ocular morbidity, and it primarily affects the younger age group population. If you're looking at severity, it's based on the type of agent, it's based on the concentration of the agent, the time of contact, the area of contact, the intraocular penetration of the agent, and the added mechanism of thermal or mechanical injury that is there. So when you're looking at a patient with chemical injury, we all do sometimes still use the Roper Hall classification, even though it is outdated because it doesn't help us prognosticate the patients. Dua's classification is better because it looks at not just the conjunctival epithelial or the limbal involvement. It doesn't talk about limbal stem cell deficiency. It talks about limbal involvement. It talks about conjunctival epithelial involvement, because if you have an extensive conjunctival defect also, it takes much longer for the ocular surface to epithelialize, and that has repercussions on the on a long-term corneal scarring or perforation. But even with Dua's classification, you can look at these two images. You have a complete corneal epithelial defect, you have conjunctival defect almost from fornix to fornix. The picture on the left still has some amount of vascularization of the sclera, whereas the picture on the right doesn't have it. So these two are not the same, even though they still come under grade 6 of Dua's classification. The outcome in these two patients are not the same. When you're seeing a white eye post chemical injury, it's an ominous sign and you need to be careful. Limbal stem cell deficiency cannot be commented upon by whatever technology we have at this point of time. Scleral ischemia is not addressed in Dua's classification still. IOP related issues are not mentioned. Exposure is not addressed. So even though we still go by Dua's classification for want of something better, we always need to be looking at these factors to prognosticate our patient. So what are the goals in management of an acute chemical injury? You basically want to get rid of any residual chemical. You want to retain or regain functions of any surviving stem cells there. You want to maintain the relatively clear cornea that you have at presentation. You want to overcome the fornicial shortening attempts of nature to maintain a reasonable fornix. And the most important, you want to prevent sight-threatening complications from happening. And the most important thing which actually will help us all is to get a quick epithelium on the ocular surface. So with this in mind, we looked at the I's and E's in the management of acute chemical injury. So the I's basically would be with respect to the inciting agent, and we've added on irrigation to it because irrigation is the most important step when the patient acutely presents to you. So when you're looking at a chemical injury coming into your OPD or your clinic, you have to immediately wash the eye. You're not worried about which solution you have to use. Whichever is available, RL or even tap water is fine. Evert the lids. If you're seeing any specific foreign particle there, you need to remove it. Do not wait or delay. This is one time where you would probably do the wash even before checking the vision of the patient. And you would ideally need to wash at least for about 15 minutes or about 1 liter of water, or you can use a pH strip to check the pH before and after the wash to be sure that you have significantly neutralized the chemical. The next is when you're dealing with tuna injury and stuff, you need to look at the fornix, because sometimes you can have this kind of tuna particle stuck in the fornix. So when you're cursory looking at the eye, you might miss it. So you need to take the child up under anesthesia and selectively go ahead and remove these tuna particles. Otherwise, they're going to be a source of constant inflammation to the ocular surface. Sometimes you can have tuna penetrating into the cornea, and these in the acute stage, you need to go ahead and remove. You might see sometimes calcium carbonate plaques stuck there, maybe even months or years after the injury. That time, if the eye is quiet, it's already reached an inactive phase where you don't need to go ahead and dig in and remove it. But in an acute stage, when you're seeing so much inflammation, this is a source of infection. It has not got completely converted to calcium carbonate. You might need to go ahead and remove the lime particle. And if you're doing that, you might need to be ready with a patch graft or a lamellar patch graft if required. So the most important thing in inflammation is in chemical injury is to control the inflammation. Steroids play a very important role. Yes, there are concerns that steroids reduce the epithelial healing, but in a chemical injury, it's the inflammation which actually retards the healing and not vice versa. So you need to start steroids. The other concern is with corneal melt with long-term steroids. Again, that comes after a 10-day period. And if you have an epithelial defect for more than a 10-day period, you actually need to take the patient up for a surgical intervention with respect to going ahead with an amniotic membrane transplantation. So if you have a smaller defect, you could probably just use a bandage contact lens and it should settle down. If you have a larger defect, you would need to use amniotic membrane transplantation. And in certain select cases, like grade 4, 5, or 6 Dua's classification, we have tried doing alloslet to improve the outcomes. And I'll come to that later. So these are just some pictures of patients with very severe grade 5, grade 6 Dua's injury, where since there is hardly any conjunctival epithelium on the surface, we did an amniotic membrane and we supplemented the amniotic membrane with an allolimbal cells to act as a source of epithelium to epithelialize the ocular surface. The idea here is not that we retain the corneal clarity. The idea is to get the epithelium on so we control the inflammation. And if these are uniocular injuries, at 4 months or 6 months down the line when the eye is quiet, you can always go ahead and do an autoslit at a much more controlled sitting as such. And we published our first article on this in BJO. And then we compared our outcomes of the allogenic transplant in eyes where we have just done amniotic membrane in our earlier phase and where we combined it with alloslet in the later phase. And we found that when we combined it with an alloslet in grade 5 or 6 DUAs, we had a faster epithelial rehabilitation. We had lesser cases which required LKs or PKs, and we needed lesser surgical interventions in terms of lesser number of amniotics had to be performed in these eyes. The other thing which was not dealt with in DUA's classification is the presence of limbal ischemia or scleral ischemia. So when you're seeing these whitish blanched areas, you need to be careful. If it's a localized area, you might get away with just medical measures. But if it is so diffuse, you need to do what is called as tenonplasty. The concept was proposed way back by Dr. Ryan, and it basically involves mobilizing the tenons from the fornix as a vascular pedicle and taking it close to the limbus and securing it to the limbal area so that you have a vascular base for the epithelium to grow on the sclera. This is a video basically showing an amniotic membrane transplantation with a tenonplasty. You can see the entire extent of defect. The tenons, when we are cutting it, is absolutely avascular, indicating there's no blood supply. We are mobilizing the tenons from the periphery, getting it to the limbus, securing it, then we are draping the surface with amniotic membrane, putting a conformer, and then suturing the amniotic to the lid margin, because this was a lid margin to lid margin conjunctival epithelial defect. And then we went and took a limbal donor and transplanted the cells. And this resulted in a faster epithelialization of the surface, and we were able to restore an anatomical integrity. And this patient, after a subsequent allogenic transplant about 3 months later, is still maintaining 636 vision in his only eye. The other thing is the intraocular pressure. If it's high, you would need to use systemic acetazolamide. If it is low, because of a ciliary shutdown, you would need to put the patient on systemic steroids. Exposure is also sometimes overlooked, so it could lead to corneal melts and perforation, and you would need to either do an SR cut down or a tarsorrhaphy or a skin graft to make sure that you close the ocular surface in severely damaged eyes. Sometimes you might have patients presenting with a melt or a perforation. Obviously, then you don't have a choice. You have to go ahead with the tectonic procedure, either a lamellar transplant along with tenonplasty, as was done in this patient, or you might have to do a PK. And in this case, we combine it with a keratolimbal allograft since it was a child to give some kind of stability to the ocular surface. And subsequently, the patient underwent a CLAU, maintaining 624 vision in that eye. So we published our reports on approach to acute chemical injuries following our eyes and E's. And basically, like you see in this diagram, the inciting factor, the exposure, the inflammation, the ischemia, the IOP, all primarily lead to an epithelial defect. And if this defect is not addressed adequately, it will lead to a corneal melt, haze, and probably infection. And this is what we need to avoid. So the most important aspect in an acute chemical injury is to somehow get the epithelium to heal. And with this in mind, we had come out with an algorithm that if there is ischemia, you need to see whether it's localized or generalized. Localized, you can observe. Generalized, you would need tenonplasty. If there is exposure which is mild or moderate, you might get away with a tarsorrhaphy. If there is severe exposure, you might need to do an SR cut down or a skin graft. If you have intraocular issues, either low or high, you need to manage it with either systemic steroids or systemic acetazolamide. But this is the most important chart here. If you have an epithelial defect which is only involving the cornea, the defect is small, a bandage lens will suffice along with medical measures. If the defect is large, you will need to combine an amniotic membrane transplant. But if you have a corneal and a conjunctival defect, again, if the conjunctival involvement is less than 50%, a routine amniotic alone would suffice. But if it is more than 50%, or there is significant bulbar and tarsal conjunctival involvement, you might have to combine it with some source of cells to to hasten the epithelialization of the ocular surface. Obviously, if you have stromal melts or scarring, or you have an impending perforation or a perforation, you need to use measures accordingly. You can use systemic doxycycline, you can use systemic ascorbate and topical citrate in the acute phase to reduce the incidence of corneal melting. Counseling plays a very important role in these patients because you need to tell them what is the outcome of the treatment, what could be the prognosis, and the fact that they need regular follow-ups and they need multiple surgeries. But if managed properly, you could give some of them fairly good vision. You will still have lacunae in our current understanding because limbal ischemia is not something that we can understand at the acute presentation. So we cannot, even though people have tried using OCT angiography to assess the extent of ischemia, it's still in the early phases, and we still cannot assess the viability of the residual stem cells which are there at the limbus to know how the eye is going to respond. If managed appropriately, even an eye which looks as bad as this in the acute stage, if you are able to tectonically salvage the globe, you could probably still go ahead and do a keratoprosthesis and give some vision to these unfortunate patients. So at least they have an ambulatory vision and a slightly better quality of life. To summarize, acute phase management is very crucial. Manage the eyes, manage the ease, anticipate complications, follow up the patient closely, and don't hesitate to take second opinions or refer to higher center as the case may be. I would like to thank my team at Shankar Nethralaya, Dr. Geeta and Shweta. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bhaskar. And our next speaker here, Namrata Sharma from Delhi. I would be doing an injustice if I introduce her to All India Ophthalmic Society or BOA members or MOS members. All I thought is when I saw her title, I said she's going down south now for politics and joining the DMK. And then suddenly I saw the E inside and I realized, oh, this is DMEK. It's not DMK. Namrata, all yours.
Thank you so much, sir, for that introduction. And I was scared what you would say because you said, "Main kuch bhi bolunga." So, kuch bhi to aapne bol diya, but thank you once again. And I'm going to be talking to you about an important topic. DMEK is the way to go. And I thought I would make it video based because that would help people to understand how to do it and how to solve problems. I would like to thank Nikhil as well as the entire organizing team of MOS and BOA, Dr. Lane and Dr. Ragini Parekh for making me a part of this. So I think DMEK is the way to go because it is the most physiological graft. Diseased Descemet's membrane is replaced with a healthy donor in the most physiological manner, and it provides the best uncorrected visual acuities. If you see all the endothelial keratoplasty procedures with least aberrations and the good contrast sensitivity. An important thing is that because the tissue is so less, the graft rejections are hardly any, to the tune of less than 1%, which when you compare to a PKP is 21%, and when you compare to DSEC is almost 7%. So just to show how the surgery is done, this is a corneoscleral rim, which has been inverted, and this dissection is being done with the help of the Sinskey hook, so that you actually detach the Descemet's membrane from the edges, stain it with the trypan blue dye, and then very slowly pull the Descemet's membrane from all four corners right in the center. And because the staining has been done so well, you can make out where the Descemet's membrane is, and then lay it back. So lay it back because now you have to triphinate it. And this is about an 8 millimeter triphination which has been done, and again stain because you have to see the edges where the triphination has been done. Remove the peripherals because they act like a noise and kind of disturb you when you are, when you are actually fashioning this graft. And because this is already detached, it is very easy to now lift the detached graft. But again, one has to be careful because Descemet's membrane is a very friable layer, and it can get torn at any time. Now, this is a case of Fuchs dystrophy with cataract, where cataract surgery has already been done, and the diseased Descemet's membrane is being removed, again using a reverse Sinskey hook. And it is detached from the periphery, and most often it comes out very easily because it's a diseased Descemet's membrane. So it comes out very easily. And this is the role of the Descemet's membrane, which we had earlier fashioned. This is then placed in the injector. This is the cartridge of an IOL injector, which this is in fact the first case of DMEK that I did in my life. So this is the injector. We had IOL cartridge injector at that time. So that is what we used, and we didn't stamp it because we thought we had a OCT and we could get away with it. So always some amount of fluid is being put on the wound side, and then look at the configuration of this graft. It has to be biceps curl upwards like this, like the red one that you see. And when you know it is there, you just put the air bubble in and you are there. So the graft is attached. You can see it with the internal reflectivity, but you can't make out whether any graft was done. And this is at post-op week 1, and this is at post-op month 1, when even your fellow ophthalmologist can't make out that a graft has been done. You have to sit on the slit lamp again and see that this is not a simple phaco, but a phaco with DMEC. Now, this is just to show how you make a S-shaped stamp if you don't have an intraop OCT microscope. This is a very nice way of knowing which side is endothelial up. Again, the Descemet's membrane is being removed. And again, after detaching it, lay it back again. And then flip the corneoscleral rim on the other side. And the S-shaped stamp is then is going to be put here after doing a trephination of about 3 millimeters there. Because you want the correct S looking at you when the graft goes into the anterior chamber, and this graft is then taken and is inserted into the Petri dish with some fluid. So now I'll just show you, this is what we published, but I will just show you, take you through the videos of DMEC in hazy corneas. This is more about hazy corneas because there it gets more difficult to do it. This is a case of ice syndrome, in fact, and you can make out that there's some iris which is stuck to the back of the cornea. So just like I showed you earlier, desmetorexis is being done after taking care of these iris adhesions. This is followed by the diseased Descemet's membrane, which is removed, and then you put the graft inside. And then this is followed by the air bubble, which is then put in. Of course, IOCT does help you in these hazy corneas to know which side is your graft up, because sometimes the S-shaped stamp also gets smudged and you can't make out. So this is just to show a case of PBK in which you can't make out where the S-shaped stamp is, but whenever you remove the epithelium, it gets a little clear. And then the diseased Descemet's membrane is again removed with the help of the reverse Sinskey. And after removing this, the graft is then injected inside, and just look at the configuration of the roll inside. The biceps curl has to be upward. So this is now an upside down graft. And when you get that biceps curl upwards, then you know that this is now folded on itself. So when it is hazy, you can actually make out on an IOCT what is happening to the graft, which otherwise you can't. And then you just tap to get the biceps curl upwards, and tap again. And then when you know that it is in the correct configuration, this is the post-op picture. Then in TAS, sometimes it can get very tricky. Notice that this epithelium hypertrophy is there, as well as notice that the Descemet's membrane is so fibrosed and so thickened, and it is absolutely white. And sometimes you think, why do you even want to do a DMEC in this case? But it does help because you're doing a less invasive procedure. And as you remove this membrane, you can see that it does get clearer a little bit. And this membrane is also removed from here. And when you put the graft, again, looking at the configuration of the scroll inside the intraop OCT microscope, one can put a suture and then put an air bubble there. Then the graft comes into the correct configuration of biceps curl upwards, and then put air bubble. So this is the correct configuration now, which it is going, and then the graft will get attached to the back of the cornea. And then over a period of time, it does get cleared up. It does take a month to clear up, but it gets cleared up. Now, sometimes even in failed DSEC, such as this is a failed DSEC, in which there is adherence to the iris as well. And then this is removed, and now a DMEC is being planned. So you can also make out the configuration here itself. So when you're getting it into the injector, get it into the injector in the same way that the configuration is absolutely correct and the orientation is correct, and just put it inside the anterior chamber, and that also helps. So this is just to show the same. And now this S, it helps you because when you put the air bubble, it is the correct S which is staring at you, and then you know your endothelial side is down. So in clear corneas, it does help you. Just a couple of animations here to show you do have a handheld slit lamp, also slit beam for DMEC graft orientation. So you can make out again how your configuration is. If you don't have an intraop OCT microscope, or if you don't have if you haven't put a S-shaped stamp. Now it is important to dock correctly, because if you don't dock correctly, then the graft can deceive you. Sometimes it really, and everything seems perfect at this point in time. But then the graft, because the docking was not complete, so the graft got ejected out rather than getting injected in. So this is the inadequate dock. So if you leave some space for the graft will very easily slip out. It is waiting to slip out because of capillary action. So leave no space for graft or for any mistake there. Then whenever you are actually putting air bubble and you're putting the graft, sometimes what happens, the graft has now come out. The immediate instinct is that will push it in. So again, one pearl that I had wanted to share here was that whenever really there is an inadequately secured wound, it will come out. So you have to inject the BSS. And if you inject the BSS beyond 50%, the graft is here and you are injecting the BSS here, then just come out. So it is important to see that you don't do that. So this is what we published based on our experience. And I would like to conclude that DMEC is here to stay. And we are only going to get better and better as the techniques and the technology shows more and more improvement. And thank you very much for your kind attention, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much. Just one query, Namrata. Was that S was for Shamar Basak?
It could be for Namrata Sharma also.
Thank you, Namrata.
S is something which Dr. Terry has, put S-shaped stamp. I don't know why he's put it as S, but
Shamar is with us on the show, and we'd love to have his comments, at least on the typed page. I'm going to invite Dr. Virendra Sangwan now. And again,
Sir, I would like to acknowledge Dr. Samar Basak, who has taught us and done a workshop at RP Center, and we've all learned it from him as well.
S for stromal site. That is so simple. No
okay, so Dr. Sangwan told me that if there's one thing that he'd like to be remembered for, it's not these high-flying days with Orbis. It's not that he does a very good marathon at Delhi. It's not his work in uveitis. It's the stem cell research and innovation that he's done. And Nikhil, hats off. You've absolutely given Dr. Sangwan the topic of his choice, and that is stem cells. Virendra, all yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Maniyar. Sir, अभी जिंदगी बाकी है, अभी याद नहीं करना, अभी जिंदा देखना है.
God bless you. Stay safe, stay healthy. Yes. Even if you are in Delhi, it doesn't matter.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So it's my proud pleasure to participate in BOA virtual symposium, and I would like to thank Dr. Ranjit Maniyar, Nikhil, Ragini Parekh, and all the leadership of BOA. I'd like to share brief views about the management of limbal stem cell deficiency. Ocular surface, as we know, is the front part of the eye which is exposed to the environment. And essentially, there are three elements which are necessary for the normal functioning: the preocular tear film, the surface epithelia, and the ocular sensitivity, surface sensitivity. And for long, we have been taught that there is a, by Richard and Thoft and Friend XYZ hypothesis, which essentially summarizes the surface epithelium, how it proliferates, how it functions, and then falls off. And now this particular hypothesis has been confirmed in the experimental animals, where you can see the column of different colored cells going and migrating to the center of the cornea, and that they falls off. So this XYZ hypothesis is no longer a hypothesis, it's a proven fact. The limbal stem cell deficiency is characterized by the conjunctival ingrowth onto the cornea, which results in chronic inflammation, epithelial breakdown, and the way you diagnose is primarily clinical, but there are a variety of other tools. Those who want to use it for clinical purposes, the diagnosis is very simple. the spectrum of manifestations and the classification can be very different depending on how you want to classify. You can have congenital or acquired limbal stem cell deficiency, partial or total deficiency, and a variety of different naming and classification systems in practice nowadays. In a study we published 4 or 5 years back in American Journal, we identified that the ocular surface burns are predominant cause of LSCD and unilateral LSCD. For bilateral LSCD, 3 important causes which contribute almost equally is surface burns, allergies like VKC and AKC, and the Steven-Johnson and TEN. From this study, we concluded that the management of unilateral and bilateral LSCD is very different because the underlying causes are very different. So therefore, for AKC and VKC, SJS, you need a allograft, and for most of the unilateral chemical burns, you need a autologous limbal transplantation. Then there are so many different techniques as the treatment has evolved. Amniotic membrane for LSCD less than 2 or 3 clock hours, maybe less than 2 clock hours. Then we used to do cadaveric limbal transplantation, then live related, then cultivated, and now the latest standard of care is the simple limbal epithelial transplantation, which is being practiced widely. The first time limbal autograft done was by Kent Kenyon and Safer Singh when they were at Mass Eye and Ear in Boston. And you see the technique of doing the surgery. They start harvesting the limbal biopsy from the corneal side, and then they go back to the limbus and the conjunctiva. But the way I started doing the limbal transplant in 1998, 99 was, I started from the other side, primarily because the anatomical landmarks are very simple, very clear, and every ophthalmologist understands it. Then we started doing cultivated, mainly because the tissue required for autologous direct limbal transplant is too much. And this technique was perfected at LVP using no fibroblasts, no autologous, no fetal calf serum. And with this technique, we've done large number of patients and demonstrated its efficacy and advantages over 10, 15 years. Then the simple limbal epithelial transplantation essentially combines the advantages of both autologous cultivated limbal epithelial transplantation and cultivated one, and mitigates the downside or the shortcomings of both the procedures. So here the biopsy, as you are seeing in this video, is very tiny. This can be covered with the graft, or you can put a tiny limbal graft there at the donor site also. And then you remove the pannus. Removal of the pannus, dissection of pannus is same in all techniques. Whichever technique you do, you need to remove the surface panel in a very simple way, and always start from the limbal side, mainly because you have the anatomical landmarks very well defined. Then combination of SARP and blunt dissection, you remove the pannus and you'll be able to find the normal cornea in most situations. And then you use your limbal explants cut into pieces. Further, we have simplified by developing a synthetic amniotic membrane. In this particular video, you will see a synthetic membrane that we have developed, and this does not need the human amniotic membrane. However, this is still not commercialized, and the company is working on it for further commercialization. But all the experiment, the studies were done in LVP while I was there. I'll just show the last part. Oh, I think I missed. Anyway, so this is the 3-year follow-up of a SLET. Now we have 7-8 year follow-up also. And these are the results which were summarized in a paper, very nice paper, which was led by Sayan Basu in Journal of Ophthalmology several years ago. Then there is a paper by Joyce and Namrata Sharma and many others who participated in this multi-center study, replicating the results what we did from LVP. Now, if you look at the growth and publication of SLET in last 5 to 7 years, it's been tremendous. It has gone to all over the world, and number of cases and surgeons doing it are increasing. And this is a summary of studies which are SLET versus CLET. If you see the CLET studies after 2012, hardly there's any study. Some studies published by us from LVP, other than none. So therefore now by default, SLET has become the technique of choice, and for obvious reasons. If you look at these 7 parameters, on all of them, the SLET is either better or equal to other techniques. And most important part is the cost of the surgery. Cost of surgery of SLET is about roughly it's $700, and CLET costs 7,000. This is Indian data and is published in BJO about 2-3 months back. And a CLET-based technology called HoloClar were available in Europe at a cost of 85,000 euro per patient. So here the real benefit of the SLET is the cost and the convenience. So in summary, the SLET is effective, replicable, repeatable, affordable, and reliable open platform technology which can be used by surgeons all over the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Open platform is the key here, and that's the hallmark of India, open platform.
Yes, yes. Ranjit, Virendra Sangwan is a really, you can say, is an excellent, I think, researcher and really doing a very good work. Thank you, Virendra Sangwan, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lani, sir. Thank you very much.
It's a formal duty now to thank all the
But
speakers.
Virendra, I always miss you on the direct conference in Mumbai. So you have promised me next time you are going to come physically to Mumbai.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That promise is still there.
Thank you, sir. Thank
you. Thank you.
And Dr. Muralidharan, Dr. Radhika, Dr. Paras, Dr. Nikhil, Dr. Bhaskar, Dr. Soma, Dr. Namrata, and of course, Dr. Virendra Sangwan. I thank all of you here. If Pankaj has managed to gather any questions so far, then we take a question before Ragini really gets upset. Right now, she's still smiling. So,
so with such a galaxy of speakers, no
I know.
There is
Nikhil,
time
hats
before and
off.
after the session.
And Sai and team, thank you, and wonderful organization, I must say. We have to give kudos to Pritam and to Parikshit and their teams also. Yeah, Pankaj, कोई है सवाल जवाब करने के लिए? Done. We'll cede way to the next session. Then thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Manya sir, for being our guru, our teacher, and for being
Welcome.
there for the beautiful session with all the stars of ophthalmology. Thank you, Sangwan sir. Thank you,
Galaxy
everybody.
of stars here today.
Thank you, everyone. We learned a lot from the distinguished speakers. Thank you very much.